dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your secret report that you never read, host Madelyn.
I'm your, audio log, host Emma.
And thanks for tuning in for another side quest episode of the show. This week, it's my turn to choose, and I've decided that we're going to be discussing world building in games. I was kind of surprised this was something we hadn't already talked about, because it feels like a broad and general category that's in the realm of things that we're interested in. But I guess I'm usually too busy picking things like that are, 2 months out of date for my side quests. So
yeah, I feel like especially recently we've picked a lot of stuff that's more like industry-y rather than like design-y, if that makes sense. I feel like we've always done that a little bit. So maybe some of the design ones that we think should be obvious, we just haven't done. Because we haven't really focused on that.
That's true. I mean, you sound like an industry insider using technical terms like industry-y and design-y, though. So if anyone didn't follow
those
that,
are the words
it's
that
okay.
they use.
Emma, is a member of the industry, so it's highly technical. So yeah, I mean, there wasn't anything particular. I mean, in all honesty, the way I came up with this topic, I was like my boyfriend, what should my side quest be? And he was like, how about world building in games? And I was like, that's a good idea from you for once. I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. That would have been mean. That's just for you listeners. He's still like 8 months behind on the podcast, so he won't remember if I was that mean or not by the time he gets to this. It's like a time capsule for him now. He's like, June.
Yeah, it's a real-life audio log.
Exactly.
To be honest, I would deeply respect a game that the audio logs were just, like, podcast episodes.
It's coming. Somebody is going to do that. Somebody has probably already done that in some kind of an indie game, but it's coming.
I think it's a great idea.
And they're like, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen. That's weird.
But yeah, really, like, instead of, like, people, like, leaving their audio diary entries, it's just, like, the podcast episodes people had downloaded. Audiobooks,
Emma, you shouldn't give away these ideas for free.
You're right, I should.
This is a great and very vivid world-building idea.
Very particular style of game, probably.
I can hear Naughty Dog right now being like, The Last of Us 3 podcasts?
If there's, like, an audiobook you can pick up, and you can just, like, listen to it throughout the game, you're just listening to the audiobook, that's pretty cool, to be honest.
Anyway, before we get too into the nitty-gritty of this, I just wanted to raise some of the questions that are on my mind that we might discuss this time. So, of course, kind of first and foremost is what makes an engaging game world, and what is world building to begin with? Maybe switch the order of those. What is world building to begin with? And then once you've defined that, maybe, what makes an engaging game world? So, talking about good and bad examples of that, and then even drilling down into what tools do you, hypothetical game designer, have at your disposal to create a cohesive and interesting world in your game. And then obviously, I feel like we talk about world building a lot, or more generally, especially in terms of open world games. No surprise, it's in the title. But obviously, it's not just restricted to gigantic games with huge amounts of lore. So I'm also interested in talking about this week how these possibilities change depending on what genre you're looking at, whether that's genre in the sort of literary sense or genre in the gameplay sense. I think those play across each other in interesting ways. And then in like runtime and size of the game, or system settings and requirements, like all sorts of things that impact how you can build this world. And then finally, it's all well and good to build it for one game, but what happens when you're instead building a series, whether you're plotting that from the beginning or you're adding it on because your game sold so well and you want to make some more money, and all that good stuff. So that's the outline, listener. You get to decide if you're interested in this world that I'm building in this audio log today or not, based on that overview summary. So Emma, you're an industry member. What is world building?
What does that have to do with being an industry member?
Just kidding. You work on games.
Theater is closer to English, so I think probably you should talk about it based on your college major.
Theater is closer to an English major. I understand. Yeah. I thought you were saying to the English language. And I was like, no. I'm pretty sure you're working on games that are in English. I mean, you won't tell me anything about them, but pretty sure.
Yes, they are. At least initially in English, yes.
Fair enough. But yeah, I mean, so world building, I mean, this is something that we see across pretty much all media. I was literally about to say it's building the world of the story, but that's not.
Thanks, Dictionary Madelyn.
You're welcome. No, I mean, it's about creating the environment and the atmosphere and the situation in which the game takes place. And I think of it really as setting up a lot of rules and a lot of systems for how your world, whether it's a book world or a movie world or a game world, functions. It doesn't have to feel as lame as setting up a bunch of rules makes it sound. But thinking about, what are the rules for weather in this world? What are the rules for language? What are the rules for, like, how people talk to each other and different groups of people? What are the rules for the three adjectives that we get to assign to every nation in your game? Like, which one is the smart nation? Which one is the conniving nation? And, rules for how you can interact with that world. So that's pertinent for mechanics as well, right? If you set up rules that magic slowly makes your ears melt off, you don't want a character that's a mage to be able to just spam spells in a fight and not see any consequences, right?
Sure.
There are certainly exceptions to that.
Unless that's important. Unless that's the exception that proves the rule.
Exactly. So setting up the rules and how I'm sorry I keep using world, but I hope you know what world means. So I don't feel that bad just defining the building part.
Sure.
But setting up the rules for your world and a consistent set of those rules. Much like the rules of the planet Earth in some ways. Like how physics works.
Sure, yeah.
And like the languages people speak. Of course, these can change over time. They can change over time in your game too, certainly. But there are rules set up for how things sort of work. Yeah. So that's what I would say world building is in general. And to me, and based on the stuff that I was reading, I think probably key and most important to a successfully built world is consistency. So once you've decided what that set of rules is, like I said, whether those are literally like laws of the society or languages or just like, here are the kinds of creatures that you can expect to see, right? If the rule is there can be dragons, then there can be dragons. If the rule is this is supposed to be modern day New York, you would probably not expect to see dragons.
Sure.
Unless that becomes part of what you've established.
Yeah.
Or whether there are rules like about the tone of the game, right? Like if you're thinking of Mad Funny Borderlands, it'd be super weird for Borderlands to suddenly take itself very seriously, right? And that's maybe more of kind of a meta rule than it is a rule about the world. But the player playing the game is part of your world, and you want them to have a consistent experience as well. So if you've established that your game is mad funny, or you've established that your game, I don't know, is like very over the top or very subdued, you probably don't want to break those sort of tonal rules that you've established for yourself either. Anyway, lots of ways to conceptualize that.
Yeah. I do think laying it out that way somehow, like, it does make it seem like, oh, before you write anything, like, you have to, like, write a detailed history of your world and, you know, the different cultures. And I feel like that's a mistake a lot of, like, consumers of media have, too, is that, like, oh, everything needs to have, like, its explanation. And sometimes it's enough to be like, there was an ancient culture that left ruins, and that's all you have to know as the author. And the players can, like, interpret that if they want, but you don't necessarily need to know the answer.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that's a part of our fixation on world building in the context of these very large, like, especially kind of high fantasy games or dystopian sci-fi games, where, yeah, like, a lot of the time these, like, very large, very open games do have a lot of baked in, like, lore as you would consider it in the most traditional sense. Mm-hmm. And this is not to say that, yeah, you don't have to figure out exactly how physics works in your world, or exactly, you know, everything about every year in history or anything like that. That's kind of lame. Yeah. The player should be able to build some of the worlds for themselves, too. That's part of why I think video games are especially kind of dope for this, is that the player can fill in a lot more of this than they can if they're reading, you know, a 250-page novel, or if they're watching a 90-minute film. There's a lot more room for people to see sketches of things and sort of fill in their own world building, as opposed to, well, in a book, I can't really look around and see the horizon or see the NPC feeding their chickens unless the author points my attention to it.
Yeah. I think the key is, like, the more important something is to the story you're telling, the more you need to flesh it out. And then, like, everything in between that can just be some scribbles.
Absolutely.
And that's really what you need to know.
And I think it's this is getting at another thing that I think is important, is that it's almost, I don't want to say it's more important, but it's equally important to make positive world-building choices, where you create rules that are, like, coherent with the other rules that you've created, or you create story that is coherent, or whatever it is, as it is to not make choices that are not coherent, right?
Sure.
So there's no reason to flesh out that super ancient culture if in doing so you're going to introduce bizarre continuity errors or just, like, a lot of questions about that. This is also sort of true, you know, the idea of world building is often to encourage immersion, right? So one way we can break immersion is with these sort of continuity or inconsistencies or that kind of thing, right? Like, if we're supposed to be having a fair and just trial, but it's revealed in the game that the judge is the brother of the person being tried, but nobody acknowledges that as being unfair or something, like you can think of all of these sorts of situations that aren't just historical continuity errors or something like that, but ways in which your plot can break rules without addressing its broken rules. And when that happens, right, it can pull the player out of the game.
Sure.
But it's also important to make sure that you're building your world in a way that is ethical and not lazy. So maybe your dark elves shouldn't be the evil elves. And maybe your orcs shouldn't be tremendously overweight and stupid, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you should consider whether, you know, many of these are recognizable tropes and other people have used them. And so in some ways, being able to, you know, stand on the shoulders of giants is a positive thing in genre world building, because you don't have to, you know, the player comes to the table understanding some things generally about who is good and who is bad and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But you should also be thoughtful that whether consciously or unconsciously, you're not building rules for your society that are, like, racist, sexist, ableist, fatphobic, homophobic, transphobic. Even if these characters aren't human or aren't American or aren't in modern times. Like, if you're building those in, like, probably you shouldn't. But if your game is, like, about one of those things, then you darn well want to be thoughtful about how you're building it into the society.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the history of fantasy tropes, at least, like, high fantasy tropes, I guess, are a little bit, especially tied up in racism.
Yeah.
So even, like, all the books you loved, like, you can love them, but also as you're writing your own work, you might want to look at them and be like, is this racist? And should I change it for my story?
And look, probably, being frank, at some point it was intentionally racist. But even if we're going to say, no, nobody realized what they were doing when they made the elves beautiful and blonde and good, and the dark elves evil and bad, even if we're going to say it was totally unintentional, it can still alienate the player, right?
Yeah.
Even if we're going to, absolve you of any racist intent or anything like that, you should still be trying to make choices that don't pull the player out of the immersion. And if the player is pulled out of the immersion by, those sorts of tropes, or casually sexist language, or gendered insults, that kind of thing, that's a lame reason to ruin your world, to ruin your immersion when you've probably worked very hard to put together other rules.
Yep.
So all that being said, consistency is important, but also, making positive choices just as important as not making, negative, bad, pulling you out of the world choices. Anyway, obviously, keeping this kind of consistency in games, I think, is harder than in many other genres. Games have a lot more, like I said, games have a lot more potential for world building in general, just because there's so much you can do, and the player can be, in many ways, so much more immersed. And I was sort of trying to parse, is that just because games are longer than most books or movies? But I don't think that's completely true. I think it's part of it. But I think having the player being able to engage with things definitely deepens the potential here.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that you have to create a space for the player to run around in. And, you can do that in books and movies, right? You can have a descriptive paragraph of the environment, or, some long pan over someone's apartment, right, that shows who they are as a character. But with games, especially, you can just, stand in that room for as long as you want, looking at everything. And you can either use that or dread that, right? especially in open world games. You're like, what's up that mountain over there?
Yeah.
And if there's nothing up that mountain,
that
kind of sucks. Yeah.
And so I think that's an important point here, which is that, you can get away with this is not to be totally consistent. I mean, this is true for all of this, right? Obviously, consistency is good, but you can break the rules in smart ways. But in games, it's a little doubly tricky because you also have the mechanics of the game to think about. And I think in games, you are in some ways, teams are a little bit more segmented. Obviously, all the way on one end of the spectrum is you're the author of a book, in which case you write the book so that you get to build the world, right? In the middle, we have maybe movies and television, maybe theater, although, theater is sort of weirdly maybe between movie, television, and books, where somebody writes it, or a team of people write it, or whatever, and there's a cinematographer and stuff, but, you've written the shots, right? And once the sets are built, they exist, and it just feels like the writer has a bit more agency over the experience, or over what the experience will be. Not that cinematography doesn't play a big role or anything. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say in some cases it's a combination between the writer and the director there. Because that's not always the same person.
Absolutely. Oh, right, of course. Absolutely. But in that sense, hopefully the writer and the director are in a normal film or in a normal television show, or more or less on the same page about what things look like, right? And are not necessarily operating at cross purposes. The goal there is it's something nice for someone to look at and listen to. Whereas in games, the story editor or the writers are not necessarily the primary artists, depending on your studio culture and yada yada yada. Of the game, and gelling with the folks who are actually designing the gameplay or doing the level design or that kind of thing, and not even just gelling, but being able to create a game that's fun that ties in with all the world building you've done or are doing, it feels more challenging here than in most other mediums.
Yeah, I definitely in design, there's definitely like the choice to make is like, or not even necessarily a choice to make, but just how things happen is like, do you come up with a story idea first, right? And is that, or a story idea or, you know, concept or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be plot based. First, and then build the rest of the game around that? Or do you think of like, oh, this mechanic's really cool, and build the rest of the game around that? I feel like sometimes you can look at games and think like, I know which one of those came first.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that's true. I'll just, like, Bravely Default, for example, like, gee, I wonder what came first. Maybe it was the Brave default system? Couldn't be.
Kingdom Hearts, I wonder what came first. Was it Disney and Final Fantasy? Sounds dope.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what came first.
But a big part, I think, of successful world building, although not a all-encompassing part, is figuring out some way to justify the mechanics of your game in the context of the world you've built. Now, depending on your genre and how forgiving people are going to be of your genre, you can get away, and frankly, probably should get away with some of this. I don't want Uncharted to try to justify to me how Nathan Drake murders hundreds of people, but is still a good dude, or isn't actually murdering them, or something, right?
Yeah.
I'm used to enough the concept of the action hero that I can kind of hand wave that, and that's fine. And that's sort of part of the world building, right? Is saying, hey, this is an action game. Don't think about this too much, right? And certainly you can fall on the wrong side of over-explaining what's going on with your mechanics, right? The player doesn't need to... Like, I was reading an example in some article of, like, okay, so what if you're playing as a character that's never used a gun before, right? And we've talked about some game where is it Alan Wake? No. There was some game we talked about over the past year and a half or so where the character was not supposed to be super great with guns. I can't remember what it is. None of my characters are very good at guns. Anyway. But so you're sort of faced with a choice here. So, you know, narratively, if your character has never used or never even seen a gun before, it doesn't really make sense that they'd be able to pick it up and know how to use it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, mechanically, it'd be super frustrating to have the character be really bad with a gun for most of the game until they get used to it. So you have kind of a choice to make of, is it going to pull the player out of the immersion more for this game to be really frustrating, or is it going to pull them out of the immersion more to have to kind of be like, okay, this person figured out how to use this really fast?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about examples. I was thinking of, like, you know, how in, like, RPGs or JRPGs, like, someone who was a boss once, like, joined your party or whatever, and they're, like, significantly weaker than than when they were a boss. And it's, like, it's a little funny when you think about it, but it's, like, that's just something you have to accept, because as a player, you acknowledge that if they joined at their boss strength, the game would be broken suddenly. Like, it wouldn't function correctly as a combat system.
And superpowered or way underpowered cutscenes, I think, fall into this world as well. It's much...
I personally have, like, no problem with, like, rule of cool situations.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you want to have your characters do something super cool in a cutscene, if Cloud can jump in a cutscene... That's fine. I understand. Okay.
Am I meant to believe that in the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Cloud Strife cannot... No, because we see him jump. He jumps across the rooftops.
Yeah, he jumps in battle, too, but there's not, like, a jump button.
I know that.
Right?
Am I meant to believe... What am I meant to believe about his ability to jump? Or, like, what am I meant to believe about a... Like, you know, when... Man, I hate this. This is fine. Like, this is fine world building. It is what it is. But when, like, they block off, you know, when things are blocked off, but, like, obviously you could go through it.
Yeah.
You
I'm always like, there'd just be a hassle. I just don't want to go to the hassle of it.
And that's fine, but it is always kind of a moment of, like, eye rolling of, you really couldn't have put something here that looks a little bit more like it's actually blocking the path.
Yeah. I generally prefer it when it's like, and I guess you can't do this all the time, but when you just go in a direction and the character stops and, like, this is dumb, I'm going the wrong way.
But see, I think that's a great example of justifying gameplay with something that's world consistent, right? Is someone saying, like, oh yeah, like, my friend is in mortal danger, probably shouldn't run back to the shop, right? Yeah. Not to say that that's always world building inconsistent, right? It doesn't ever really bother me that much in, like, the Yakuza games where they're all in 4, I just finished 4, and they were all just like, let's go to the convenience, like, you need any time to go to the convenience store before we storm the Millennium Tower? And I was like, eye roll, like, oh, Akiyama, you're in a game.
Yeah, I do think it's funny when, like, there's the intense music happening, but you can still, like, go shopping, though.
Yeah. But to me, like, that feels fine to the world of that game, because the world of that game is much more built around, like, there's a tone, right? Yeah, and that tone is, it's either very, very, it's very, very serious, or it's very, very, it's just campy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, one other world building kind of thing to bear in mind before I jump to talking about, like, tools and genre and other stuff, is, and this is sort of obvious, but the constraints of your system, right? Obviously, my expectations for how you have built and established your world are super different if you're shipping me a brand new game for the PlayStation 5 than if I'm looking at a Game Boy cartridge or a mobile game, right? And not just in terms of the graphic fidelity, right? But also in terms of, I mean, literally space, literally file size, but also just, sort of expectations and conventions and that sort of thing, that I'm gonna, in some ways, be more forgiving. Not more forgiving, but just the way you can build the world is necessarily more limited, and you have to be aware of those limitations. And that's important no matter the size of it, and no matter if you're working with basically limitless space on a PlayStation disc or whatever.
It sure is foggy in Silent Hill,
It's very foggy. And I hadn't thought about this, because obviously I don't have one of these, and it's perpetually 5 years away, right? But I read something interesting about how this is really important in VR. That if you make a room that is this, like, even if you're making a realistic game, if you make a room that is the size that the room would be in VR, that's going to be way too big for the player. It's going to be overwhelming. Or if you put a player in the kinds of hallways that work great in games like Half-Life or any kind of game where you're in a mysterious governmental facility, right? But in VR, that could, be much more claustrophobic than it ever comes across playing it, on a screen.
Yeah.
So not just even in that kind of where theoretically, VR should have incredible world building potential because you're more immersed in the game than ever before. I mean, the technology isn't there yet, but theoretically. But it's interesting to think about.
Once you're done being motion sick.
Emma is never done being motion sick.
Nope.
But theoretically,
just watching people play VR makes me motion sick. So
but it's interesting to think about what compromises do you have to make even if you're making something realistic, to make it reasonably realistic. In sort of the same way as, am I meant to think that none of these characters ever use the bathroom?
That's every story, though. Like, I don't want to follow your character every single time they use the bathroom. I just assume it happens at some point. Like, especially ones where it's like some like high stakes thing taking course over like a very short period of time. You're like, nobody has to pee. I feel like I would need to pee.
Does Kiefer Sutherland ever pee on 24?
I don't think so.
Dang. All right, so let's talk a little bit about tools for this. And I think some of these tools are... We should talk a little bit about shorter games or like non-standard genre for world building. But these are probably tools that you're going to see more commonly in action-adventure games of moderate to long length. Although you can see them in shorter games too. So I started making a list. I don't know if you have ideas to add, but I'll start throwing things out there. So, hey, theoretical game designer, a game designer interested person, hoping to take the big wiki of world building stuff that you built for yourself and put it in the game. Here's some ways you can do that. Number 1 is the super overt, literally throw the lore in the game options. This is things like, if we're in a fantasy game, it's ancient books that people can pick up, or papers that they can read in the library about the history of your world, and all of that good stuff. Or it's Ansem reports, if you're Tetsuya Nomura. Mm-hmm. Or that, written, any kind of written stuff.
Yep.
Or it's, like Emma said, Emma the audio log. Lots of audio logs. I feel like that is so classic for kind of the dystopian sci-fi version. That's like the I think people have just
realized that players won't read. So, like, fine. It's audio now.
It's very true.
That's not like a dig. I don't really read in games very much either, so.
I'll only do it, and this was something that I found especially interesting when I was reading various perspectives on world building in games. I'll only read if I feel like it's actually going to enhance my understanding of what's going on. So, like, I mean, this is foolhardy, right? But I will read the Ansem reports. Maybe I don't genuinely believe those will enhance my understanding of what's going on, but I wish they would. I was reading, and maybe you can attest to this. I don't know if does Control have audio logs? Is that what it is? Or is it...
It has documents and videos, and maybe also audio logs.
Okay, so maybe I was thinking of it being written. Someone was saying, the stuff in Control I actually read because it actually was the only way you could understand what was going on.
I didn't think it really enhanced my understanding of what was going on. I didn't think that was super important to Control anyway. It definitely fleshes out what the Bureau does, I guess, but I didn't feel like it was, like, explaining the plot to me. Maybe the Darling videos were, though.
Fair enough.
You'll run into, like, live-action footage of this guy named Professor Darlington, I think is his name.
Sure, of course.
And he'll, like, explain relevant concepts to you as you, and like, encounter them.
So, my point being, though, that there are ways to build the lore into your games that the player wants to read it because they think that they are going to understand the game in a more meaningful, better way from it. Mm-hmm. And I will read those. But I do find it not especially interesting in, in my dabbling in Skyrim or my dabbling in any of these, like, especially gigantic high fantasy games. I just can't. There's too much. And it's just not that important.
Yeah.
It's inessential, which is sort of what some of these takes are saying is, like, isn't it interesting that in these games so much of the world building is so inessential that we can't even be bothered to read it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about, like the library in Fire Emblem Three Houses, for instance. Like, you can go in there and, like, read the entire history of the world, but it's not super necessary to, like, understand the plot or the characters or whatever. If anything, I think it's just a reaction to people being, like, really not liking the lack of world in the previous game, where the continent doesn't even have a name, apparently. It doesn't even name the continent, which feels like you gotta name your continent in your fantasy game. You gotta give it some silly name. Come on. Or, like, in the Cold Steel games, there's all these books that I pick up because I talk to everybody in the game, but I don't feel like I need to read the books because I talk to everybody in the game, and the NPC player dialogue is enough. Like, that's one thing that I think the Cold Steel game does really well, is, like, having the NPCs give you world information, but also making them seem like they're, like, characters with lives, Like, all these incidental characters have their own, like, little plot lines happening in the background of your greater plot. but they'll also, like, flesh things out for you just by talking to them, which is nice. And so I don't read any of the books because I don't really feel like I need them. Maybe they would enhance my understanding a little bit, but reading. Who wants to read?
Yeah, and it's just like in some ways it's also not terribly realistic a lot of the time, right? Like, reading books or sometimes the kind of exposition NPCs, depending on how we've set up the game, right? It doesn't really make sense that some of these people are going to be telling you very basic information about the world, like Gerald lives here, right? Like,
yeah.
He's been a Witcher. Like, nobody needs to explain any basics to him. I don't really know if they do that in The Witcher. That was just a hypothetical example. But unless, and this is something I'll get to in a minute, unless we've established a new in town protagonist, oftentimes, and even then in some cases, it just doesn't make sense. Or it doesn't make sense your character would be spending time reading the history of the world, and then it doesn't impact any way about how they react. So, not that there's anything wrong with having extraneous world building, it's just particularly interesting to me that in games, so much of that lore can be very, very sidelined.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the giant graffiti on the wall method.
Very realistic.
I know. It really is.
I did think it was really funny, all those tweets earlier in the year that was like, I'm sorry, dystopian world builders. You were correct. People will graffiti obvious statements on the wall.
There was a great one that we would walk by to pick up our farmer's market vegetables this summer by a closed restaurant. It was a heart that originally said art in it, but somebody had added an F. So and it was so funny. And I'd like that in the game, please.
That's good. More funny graffiti.
Please. I feel like I've just handed that over for Borderlands 4. There it is. Mad
You're
funny.
Right.
So all of those I think of as being kind of like very overt, like, hello, I'm over here building the world, giving you lore kind of things.
Yeah.
Another way we can get the player kind of introduced to the world is, like I said, with our new in town protagonist. And that allows us to have our exposition NPCs like a little bit more justified, right? If you're literally new to the town, it does make sense that they would be explaining to you basic things about how it works. So, like, my example is, like, yes, Chet McDude, whose name in itself probably breaks the immersion, right? But whatever. Chet McDude, i.e. my Persona 5 character, if you're new in town, there's my exposition, my talk this world building for you. He is literally new to Tokyo, right? Or new to the school. Why can't
new to Tokyo.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
But that doesn't affect the fact, like, that's fine. Like, that means he has to learn how to navigate the subway.
Oh yeah, there's immersion for you.
That was
You're right. He's new in town,
real.
So he doesn't know how the subways work. Of course.
No, that was not real at all. Emma did an excellent job navigating the subway when we were in Japan. I didn't have to think about it at all. Most of the time. I didn't have to think about it at all. You just said, like, here's how we get there. And I was like, great. But the fact that Chet McDude is new in Tokyo, like, that's not really relevant to the fact that Morgana is going to have to explain palaces to him. Right? So you don't have to be literally...
because he's new in town to that, too.
Exactly.
Right?
That's saying you don't have to be literally new in town. There could just be something that, it does make sense that this needs to be explained to this person for X, Y, or Z reasons.
Yeah. One example that I was reminded of in one of the articles I read is also, like, language barriers, right? So, like, in Final Fantasy X, is it Titus or Titus? I don't remember. But he falls into this new world, basically, and I can't remember the race of people who pick him up, but they have their own language. So, like, the initial scene of, like, Titus on the boat, like, you have no idea what's happening because Titus doesn't understand the language. And I think throughout the game, like, you find, like, documents that help you learn the language a little bit. So as you go through, you can understand that language more. And then just as like a fun bonus thing, I think you retain that knowledge if you start the game over so that you can see what the people were saying on that ship as the player, even though Titus still can't understand, which is a fun thing to do. Especially that's a unique way of dealing with the language that games can do as well, I think.
But that's also a cool example of those sort of infotomes actually impacting something about how you play the game, right? It's worth your time to bother to read. I mean, I don't know if they're optional, right? I haven't played the game, but if they are, it's worth your time to read those because that'll actually change your experience of the game, presumably for the better, unless they're just like being horribly mean to you all the time. Maybe for the worse. I don't know.
Yeah, one thing, when I played The Last of Us Part 2, one of the things I appreciate is, like, there's a bunch of documents that are just there for world-building purposes, but also a bunch of them will be like, oh, there's supplies stashed in this building, right? Like, someone wrote a note letting someone know, or, oh, I found the gate code I needed. So, like, there's an encouragement to pick up these documents, because you're like, oh, maybe I'll find something useful for my gameplay experience, or that will help me progress the plot, you know? It's not just, like, passive information that you're gaining. It's active information, I guess.
Exactly. And what more active information can you gain than doing side quests? I think side quests are kind of the ultimate world-building tool, to be honest. Just because they let you... It's so hard when you're locked into your main story, I think, to really get to... Because you have to tell the story, right? And to really be able to flesh out your world and how it works, side quests, I think, are in some ways the best way to do that. Not that you need them. I want to be clear. These are all, like, options you have. You don't need to do any of these things to successfully build a coherent world. But if you're trying to build one beyond a certain size, probably some of these things are going to be more or less necessary if you're going to really want the player to really get the sense of what you've built.
Yeah, side quests are a little tricky, though, because in many ways they're sort of ideal for world building, because that doesn't really touch on the character that much. Although, again, they can't really learn anything too important unless that's going to impact the main plot, right? Unless you're building the side quests in so that they do affect what happens in the main plot. But generally, that's not how it works. So you have to always be careful with them that, like, you're not, like, changing your character in a drastic way or, doing anything that's going to touch where the main plot is going, you know? Yeah.
And, of course, the classic problem with side quests is, and I mean, I think there's plenty of comics and plenty of memes about this, but, like, the princess is in the castle and she's being tortured and you're running around herding sheep. Yeah. For the village boy.
Yeah.
So, well, that's certainly a very much, not even a genre convention, like a cross-genre convention that can probably mostly be hand-waved as this is a video game.
Yeah.
It is sometimes something to think about. I mean, to think about in terms of how it breaks the flow of the story, frankly, but also to think about, okay, at what point does it start to feel like the urgency of this has gone away, right?
Yeah.
And how does that affect how the player is experiencing the game? And also, how does it affect players who maybe don't realize that the dots on the map are supposed to be side quests and play all the way through doing, like, 2 of them?
He didn't think, like, what are these dots? And, like, go look at them? It just so...
Clickbait Boyfriend had a much less rich experience of the first arc of Nier Automata, because he did not complete any side quests.
It's so funny.
I know, it does continue to be very funny. I hadn't thought about it for a long time until just now. I was like, oh man, glad I deleted that data for him by mistake.
Oops.
So we've talked a lot about, how this works in genre for, like, fantasy games and dystopian sci-fi and just sci-fi games, right? Mm-hmm. But I want to talk a little bit about world building in kind of more non-standard game genres, because, like we've talked about, in fantasy and in sci-fi, most of the ways you're building your world are actually probably not that different from the way you would have done it if it was a book. I mean, you have a lot more tools at your disposal, you can make things a lot richer, but, it's all sort of on that Tolkien or like classic sci-fi model of there can be all this other lore like outside of the book, right? And that kind of thing. And relying on faction identities and all of that. But I would be remiss to not throw Hades into the mix here as an example of taking a genre that perhaps wouldn't necessarily be known for especially rich world building, and changing it to be something that not only works, but takes the mechanic and turns it into a tool for fleshing out the world.
Yeah. I will say Hades cheats a little bit, right? It is leaning on some stuff. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Feel free to lean on existing mythologies as long as you're, being chill about it. But, not everybody knows Greek mythology, but, they use that to imply things so that the player will understand it, right? Like, sort of thinking that, you'll have a richer experience in some ways if you have some existing knowledge.
Absolutely. That's true of the fantasy and sci-fi stuff, too, though, I think, for the most part.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to have a richer experience of Skyrim if it's not your first, high fantasy sort of experience, right?
Sure, yeah.
But I think even without that crutch, which I agree, definitely allows them to do a lot with a little, I think that they've stumbled upon a tool that no doubt many roguelike developers will now start to implement, right? That could be used effectively regardless of the source material.
Yeah. Hey, I'm not complaining. Copy Hades, roguelike developers. Maybe I will play your game that way.
But I will say that's not to say that there isn't world building that happens in a more traditional roguelike. And that's something I want to be sure to say. That your world does not have to be built of story. Like, you don't have to make your story more and more dense in order to build a world. Please don't, if that's not the game that you're making. Like in my limited experience with Spelunky, something that is sort of interesting about Spelunky, too, is that, in a way, you do become more familiar with the conventions of the world the more you play. I've gotten much better at recognizing, like, oh yes, this is the danger that I'm jumping into the more times that I die. And that's sort of a world building of its own. It's not necessarily a world building that's especially outside of the player experience, but you are constructing this set of rules that becomes more and more familiar over time. So while a lot of the world building tools we've talked about, and a lot of world building is very story centric, it doesn't have to be, and your game doesn't have to have this like gigantic 100-hour story in order for you to have successfully built a world.
Absolutely.
Other places where I see bizarre world building sometimes is in battle royale games. This is something I struggle to understand as someone who doesn't really play them, but there feels like there's a lot of very external lore for the characters in all of these games.
Yeah. Well, there's that. There's definitely that. Overwatch and Apex Legends and there's some other game.
Valorant does some of this, too.
Valorant. Like, have, like, characters with, like, personalities and, like, history and certain amounts of, like, external media, depending on which franchise you're talking about.
Fuses in Apex, if you missed this a couple weeks ago, is that he's in his 50s.
Some of them are in their 50s. And I think that's interesting just because, like, that one's interesting because it provides, like, a few different ins for, like, choosing a character, right? Like, someone's gonna go in and be like, okay, what's mechanically best for me? And someone's gonna go in and be like, I love, the hamster in Overwatch. And they're gonna pick the hamster for no other reason than that, right? Which just, it wouldn't be the same if they were all just, like, standard Soldier Man A, B, C, D, and E, just with different skills, you know? But I do also think that stuff like what Fortnite is doing or has been doing is interesting, in its own way. Because they don't have, like, characters in the same way. They have, like, designs you can get and skins you can get. And maybe Fortnite is the more, like, you can definitely look at it skeptically, And believe me, I look at Epic skeptically in its own way. But I think that, like, its seasons idea is pretty cool. Right? Like, there's, like, the point where there was, like, a meteor hanging over the map for a few weeks, and then, like, it hits, and then suddenly in the next season there's all these weird gravity fields that, like, affects how you play the game, but also was, like, this big event that people were, like, talking about, you know? And I know that's because they want people to talk about Fortnite, but, you know,
of course,
so do all game developers.
All of the world building in massively multiplayer online, but especially in Battle Royale, is sort of inexplicably or inextricably tied to the branding of it,
yeah,
to the sale of it, which is fine.
I mean, to be fair, all games, right? Like, all games want you to hit an event and be, like, talking about it, right? Like,
you're right. I think it's just a little more overt in these kinds.
Sure, yeah. Anything that's live is always having to engage with its player base, right? Like, all the time. And different games find different ways to do that. So I just think this is an interesting way to do it, of, like, encouraging player discussion. I think that Fortnite has perhaps taken it to, like, fanaticism levels in some ways, but at least that the core of the idea is interesting.
And, you know, even getting away from these sort of, like, story and character-based building in those games, just the level design is the world building in these games, right? I mean, not to say that all of these games are the same. I recognize that they are not. I recognize that there are distinct elements of gameplay to Fortnite and to Apex and to Valorant and to whatever, right? But they're probably more or less appealing to the same player base, right? Not exactly. I realize there's, like, a casual to serious level of it, right?
Yeah.
But they're probably in the middle. There is a lot of overlapping player base that they are competing for. And so how you brand your world, and I don't mean that in terms of literal brand partnerships, but obviously the look of Fortnite and the look of Apex and the look of PUBG and the look of all of these, look of Overwatch, are very different. Mm-hmm. And so, like, that, I think, does a ton of the world building for them as well, is just like, this is the look of the game, and does that appeal to you? Anyway, I won't dive into these other ones, but it's interesting to think about, like, okay, in a puzzle game, like, what is the world building in Baba Is You? What is the world building in a sports game? Right? Yeah. I won't dive into these, but it's just interesting to think about in genres that have less traditional narrative. What are you building here? Because you still are.
Yep.
And so I'll throw the short game caveat before we jump and talk about sequel. This has all gone on much longer than I thought it would, which is typical.
It's a big topic.
But I'm speaking of small topics, you can build a really successful world in a small game. Loath as I am to say it, because I still haven't finished it, and I'm bad at the game, but Portal, for example, builds a very coherent, very cohesive world in a game that's less than 5 hours.
Yeah.
Right? And we can see tons and tons and tons of examples of that in smaller games. You don't have to have a giant world. You don't have to answer every question about your world. It just has to be coherent.
Yeah.
And in some cases, answering more questions about your world is probably bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just really comes back to, like, you only have to answer the questions that are relevant to your story, really. You can allude to more questions. It makes it seem like the world is bigger than it is, but for your purposes, you really only have to answer the questions that you have to.
I can't believe I'm saying, I'm agreeing with this. Me, the queen of unsplit screen, being like, but how does Hero Society work in My Hero Academia?
Are we sure him freezing them was a metaphor? A metaphor in My Hero Academia?
That was weird, though. My Hero had never done that before, and that was why it was hard for me to understand. Never used a
metaphor.
Okay, I'll move away from anime for a moment. And so let's talk about, okay, so it's all, you've had a successful first game. You've built a world. But now the publisher comes back to you and says, it's sold so well, let's make a sequel. Uh-oh. World building disaster. Also giant world building opportunity, but probably mostly world building disaster.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like it's that big of a deal in terms of world building. I feel like it's either like, well, there's more, I could tell more stories with these characters, so let's just move on from there. Or like, let's jump 1,000 years into the future, you know, and just like start over.
I guess what I'm saying is I feel like on the show a lot, and I won't list examples because it's like every freaking episode. We'll like talk about it, it's like, well, okay, either the sequel, like the first sequel, is better than the first game because they have better budget and they can make more of the game they wanted to actually make and they can successfully expand the world. And then it goes off a cliff. Or the sequel is markedly worse than the first game. Like, we see a lot of sequel decay. I mean, just in all media, right? But this is a video games podcast.
Yeah.
And my theory is that a lot of that has to do with the rules for the world that you build for yourself in that first game. Partially because a lot of the time you've wrapped up the first game in a bow and it involves breaking some of the rules that they're even back for game 2, right? That could be sort of not that that's not something that can't be taken care of, but sometimes even that can just the existence of a second game kind of breaks the immersion.
Sure.
And sometimes it comes down to the rules you created in that first game were kind of sloppy, and then you get to the second game and you're trying to answer more questions and you realize, oh, there's a reason I didn't answer these questions in the first game, but you have to because the second game has to be bigger, and so it can get messy.
I almost think the issue would be if you're too specific in your first game.
Well, that too.
Because it doesn't leave you any room to grow the world if you've already answered every single question.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah, I think ideally in the first game, you've left yourself enough space that there are questions that you can continue to answer that you've left open. But you also... I
mean, that's just good for fan engagement, too, right?
Right. Yeah, you gotta have people be, emergent world building I won't even touch.
You gotta get people writing the post-credit fan fiction,
It's very true. So, like, proposals to you, anonymous game developer, for things to think about for your options for coherent sequel building. So, like Emma said, potentially you could just continue the story. This may or may not be tricky depending on how you ended the first game. But if you have characters you want to continue to just tell the story with, hopefully you've left yourself enough room to do that without leaving a horrible cliffhanger ending. That's not going to be true for every game, right? If it's either too neatly tied up, or you're just not interested in those characters anymore, or it's just not narrative enough of a game to do that, obviously you're not going to be able to do that. I feel like the second option is, the first game was local and small. The second game blows up the world, makes it super big, or moves you to an entirely new area of the world. This is kind of nice because it lets you keep the characters that we're familiar with and that people like, potentially, or some of them, but you're also in a new space, and, necessarily that means that you probably didn't talk about this, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of Horizon Forbidden West, right? I think that's a savvy way to have taken that series, right? To be like, let's put her somewhere else so there can be new things.
Yeah.
But there's, plenty of examples of that. Another option is to just really double down on the existing spaces you've created. This, to me, feels like the Yakuza series has more or less mastered this, in that you're just making more and more and more and more detail, and slowly evolving Kamurocho, for example. Doesn't necessarily need to be the exact same place, but...
Yeah, I mean, one benefit of the Yakuza series is, like, you never end the series being like, and then there were just no more, factions.
And then the Yakuza was over.
And then Yakuza came together and we're all kumbaya. Every single one. Like, there's always... It's never like that, so you can always be like, oh man, the Omi Rengo is still doing their thing, or whatever.
Yeah.
So with that one, it's nice because you always have, like, well, like, this conflict was resolved, but there's tons of ambitious people in these different groups, and so it doesn't feel unnatural for, like, new enemy to appear.
Exactly. And look, I talk about Yakuza enough on the show, so I won't dwell on this too much, but I do think that the world of that series is a particular kind of masterclass in, well, it's the same place, but you can and so it's familiar, and it follows the same rules, but you can watch it grow and change just enough. Like, I think the real delight of that series is, you get used to the familiar characters that you see, even the characters that are not important, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's an option for you if you really like the place where your first game takes place and you feel like you've left yourself enough narrative room to keep telling stories there. And then finally there's like this isn't really a sequel, but it's the Pokemon or Final Fantasy style sequel where it's like you're taking some of the rules that you've built and some of the elements, but like you're not moving to a different place in the world. Well, you sort of are in Pokemon, right? But whatever. You're moving to an entirely new world.
Yeah.
Which is sort of interesting and almost sort of like game unique, I feel like. That's sort of a unique way that I can't even think of any other genre or any other medium being able to do. Being able to say, like, yes, we are going to have Moogles and Chocobos, but these are not, and we're going to use a similar system and that kind of thing, and they use the same money, but we are not going to acknowledge that at all.
Yeah.
And that's not even getting into prequels and all sorts of stuff too. Prequels are sort of interesting, I think, because in some ways they're more rule bound, in other ways they are less rule bound.
Well, I think it's a cool idea to be like, okay, I wrote this like legend in my story or something, and be like, okay, so it's been like 1,000 years since then, so I have the basic gist of it, but it's a legend, so it's not necessarily like what happened. So it gives you like some outline to work with without having to be like beholden to it, because that's just how stories are passed down through time, right? Especially in like fantasy settings.
Yeah. But that's smart world building, to leave yourself that space.
Yeah.
I think that overall the big takeaway from this episode is like, you just need to leave yourself enough space to change your mind later on. If you want to make...
Or don't. Or just be like, no. I will not make a sequel. I respect that too.
But I think leaving enough space is important from just a fan engagement perspective as well. Like, you just don't want to have answered every question.
Yeah, that's fair.
And besides, if you ever change your mind, you just make a remake of the game and you rewrite the history of it.
Yeah, do it.
That you can do as well.
Do it. Moogle Yuffie.
It's kind of like a Snuggie.
I love it.
I think I would like...
It justifies the entire remake, which I already like. But, I mean, if the concept was like, I want to put Yuffie in a Moogle suit in Midgar, and that's why they made it, I would understand. Final
Fantasy VII Remake is a whole other, like, can of world-building worms, I feel like.
I love it.
No, I appreciate it. It's like the world that it's building on is like the real world's perception of Final Fantasy VII. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can sew a little, right? You can sew me a Moogle Snuggie with a hood.
Yeah, sure.
Just buy a Snuggie, add a red thing to it, and some eyes.
All right.
My birthday is in 3 months and change, so you got plenty of time to figure it out.
That's world building. Now you know Madelyn's birthday.
Me casually throwing my birthday in?
Yeah.
Little did you know, Emma and I were talking before the show, we were like, yes, we've established that we are real people. But like, my boyfriend is really just a world-building tool.
All right.
The occasional sound in the background is just to remind you.
Yeah, this is really a high production fictional story happening here. Really slow burn.
It's like a KDMA. Well, listeners, I think I'll wrap up our discussion of world building here. Leave us enough space to build on it for a potential sequel.
What do you think of world building? Give us that listener engagement.
Yeah.
Fans.
Yeah, listeners, what games have you found particularly immersive or particularly successful in their building of fictional worlds? What genres do you have kind of thoughts on how the world building takes place in them that aren't high fantasy or sci-fi or typical RPG action adventure? Is all world building that takes place in Japan derivative of Persona 5 and Enchantment Dude? What horrible tropes do you wish would go somewhere to die, or be subverted in some way? If you have thoughts on any of this or anything else we talked about, or any of the things that we didn't talk about but left openings for, well, you should follow us and let us know on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. So check us out there. Emma's series on YouTube is not exactly about world building, but I think that world building comes into play on... Why can I not remember what the original series is called?
Play This?
I thought it was Play This, and I was like, it can't possibly be Play This. I was like, that's two in the world of Talk This for its name to be Play This. So I started to doubt myself. But Play This often deals, at least tangentially, with world building. So check it out. Or check out On Topic Corner. Off Topic Corner is a podcast thing. There's some word building for you right there, some lore. Check out On Topic Corner on Cold Steel as well. So I feel like, well, that's about the character. It is sort of about the world, too.
Yeah, one day I will make a new video. Day is not now.
More world building. Anyway, listeners, another place you can learn more about the lore of the show is on our website. So check out www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show. You can read bios for us that are a good couple of years out of date, so they really are lore. And you can check out the games in the hats, which I'll talk about what next week's are very shortly when I get my brain to remember them. And also the blog, where you can read long-running series, Clickbait Boyfriend, where my boyfriend plays the Kingdom Hearts games and provides valuable context to what it's like to be me outside of the hour recording the podcast each week. And Split Screen, where Emma and I watch Coffee Prince and My Hero Academia.
Yep.
I just saw an article this week that cited Coffee Prince and Boys Over Flowers as the first two K-dramas on their list to watch. And I was like, somebody's been reading Split Screen. So you should read it too. Let's see. Next week on the show, before I tell you to subscribe, because you're going to be so excited that you won't be able to stop yourself from subscribing, we're talking about Heavy Rain, and we're talking about Marvel's Avengers. I did remember it.
Good job.
Look at me. So it's gonna be a fun superhero and Sean the superhero packed week. So if you don't want to miss that, you don't want to miss any episode of the podcast, you should subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere you can find podcasts or audio logs of any kind, you'll find Talk This. So like I said, next week, Heavy Rain and Marvel's Avengers, and then in 2 weeks, the side quest, I don't know, baton returns to Emma.
Yeah, so, well, I hope this week, your world has consistency.